this, I don't remember now whether it's the 40th or the 41st session. 40th, is it? Okay. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Pradip Krishen for this talk. I'll just say a few words because I see a lot of new faces this time. That Greha, who runs this forum, if you like, started this some years ago in an attempt to try and, sounds rather pompous, but to get the architectural profession to become more civilized. Because, you know, to sort of confront society, which they actually are supposed to be working for. And I noticed there are a few architects in the audience, not too many. That's what we find every time. So we started as a forum to discussion amongst architects. And then after a while, the Habitat Center was kind enough to offer us this place as a venue for holding talks. And we had decided by then to make it wider based and have people from all professions to come and talk. But about the subject, being architecture and society, in fact, it's very easy to put things under this rubric. It's rather a wide rubric. So with that said, I'll ask Pradip to take over the evening. After Pradip's talk, we'll sit and we will encourage questions and discussion. So thank you, Pradip. You come and please tell us.
I'm going to go into the darkness and so that you can see the slides better. Can we just let them know, Sachin? The little presentation that I've prepared today is really an attempt to try and share what has been 13 years of working in the desert, in different parts of the desert in different ways. I'm not really going to talk about, sorry, I need to be closer to the mic. Yeah. I'm not really going to try and give you a little rundown on each of the projects I've done, but I will touch upon them in various ways. But yeah, I will steer the presentation up in a way that will become pretty obvious as we go along. Now, sorry, the first place that actually offered me an opportunity in 2005 was Mehrangarh Fort and the trust that runs Mehrangarh Fort, the Mehrangarh Museum Trust. Those of you who've been to Jodhpur probably know that Mehrangarh is perched atop a large outcrop of rock. And this rock is a rather special rock. It's called rhyolite, which is an igneous rock from an event that happened roughly 750 million years ago, long before India had drifted up and docked with Eurasia. But it's a very hard crystalline rock, a very difficult rock. And the place that had been offered to me for the Rewilding project was lay, on three sides of Mehrangarh Fort. So the big challenge before one was, how do you actually start working with what is essentially an extremely rocky place that was also overrun with what they call bavlia in the desert. Bavlia is Prosopis juliflora. I'll come to that in a minute. All the early pictures of Jodhpur that were available to me all celebrate the rockiness, the rhyoliteness of this particular site, including this little tourist brochure that I found somewhere. But one of the things that, I'm not going to go into the question of how we persuaded the trust to actually do a rewilding project, but let me just say very briefly that when we began, the brief to me was, can you green this area for us? This was the adjunct space to the fort, and they said, can you green it to us? And I said to them, are you prepared to bring in a couple of million tons of soil, and are you prepared to water your plants for the rest of your days, every single day? And they said, no, that doesn't sound like a very sound idea. And I said, well, in that case, please let me try and persuade you that the only viable, practical way to proceed is to try and do a very strict ecological restoration of a rocky part of the desert. And that was what was agreed. Now, sorry, to go back to this picture, one of the issues was, if you're rewilding a rocky part of the desert, what did this particular part of Mehrangarh look like in the past? The only clues we really had was this particular drawing by an Englishman from roughly 1898. And if you look at the picture carefully, what you can make out is you can tell the thor, the candelabra, the thing that looks a little bit like a cactus, which is a euphorbia, which you actually get in rock. And you can just about tell the acro, the calotropis, which you see, which you can see there. But most of the other depictions of plants are kind of generic pictures. They don't really tell you what these plants are. And it was pretty obvious that we would actually have to go out into the desert and look at other rocky parts of the desert, especially parts that had the same kind of rock, to see what was growing in the desert. There was a huge difference between the way this area looked, what it looked like in the past, and what it looked like after 1930. We discovered that one of the Maharajas, Maharaja Umed Singh, had been told that, look, if you want to green your part of the desert, what you need to do is, there's this magical plant that comes from Mexico and from South America. You need to get hold of the seeds. Maharaja Umed Singh used to fly his own aeroplane, and I like to think of him looking a little bit like Biggles with the kind of leather strappings, on his driving his airplane. But he literally went up in an airplane and dropped, hundreds of bagfuls of Prosopis juliflora seeds throughout the kingdom of Jodhpur, which is a lot larger than the district of Jodhpur is today. Jodhpur, the kingdom of Jodhpur would have extended all the way to the borders of what is now Gujarat. So the situation as we found it was that you can just about make out the old city wall, which runs along the crest of this hill, and all the land between the old city wall and the fort, which is where this picture is taken from, was actually infested with Prosopis to an extent that is, I'm showing you these pictures, but literally it was just cheek by jowl. So wherever there was the semblance of any soil, you had Bavlia growing there. Wherever you had an outcrop of rock like this one, then the Bavlia perhaps wasn't present there, but it was everywhere. So you had thousands and thousands of trees. And I'm sure that other people who are going to be doing similar work almost anywhere in the dry parts of India will face a similar situation of how do you get rid of Prosopis juliflora? Because by reputation, we know that you can't just lop it off at ground level, it just coppices and comes up again. Now, I've told this story before in extenso a couple of times. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but what you need to know is that basically Prosopis juliflora has a budding zone that extends roughly 2.5 feet below the surface of the ground. So that means if you cut it less than 2.5 feet below ground, it's going to resprout. And the reason why this is dangerous is that one of the reasons why Prosopis is so effective and so successful is that it has an alkaloid that it secretes in the root zone, which inhibits other plants from growing close to it. So unless you actually get rid of Prosopis juliflora entirely with its root system, it's not going to succeed. Now, we tried various methods. Again, I'm going to truncate this story because it's too long. But eventually, we found a community of people who are called Khandwalias, who are traditional miners of Marwar. And we were told that these people will help you to actually to break into the rock and dig down as deep as you need to go, because nothing else seemed to offer a fair opportunity of doing this. Now, what the Khandwalias do essentially is They're a very tough crew of people. They use hammers that are roughly 4 kilograms heavy. The head is 4 kilograms heavy. They tend to strike the ground and listen to the sound of their hammers on the ground. And from the sound of the hammer on the rock, they can actually tell how the rock is interbedded, where it's hollow from. All the information they need to actually cut into the ground, they gain just from their hammer blows. It was just brilliant to see them at work. So we hired 15 of them after experimenting for a few months, and eventually proceeded literally tree by tree, person by person, plot by plot. And it took us eventually 7 years to eliminate Bavlia from what was 72 hectares of land, literally because we had to go tree by tree. These are just a couple of pictures to show you basically how they were doing this. And these are pictures that show you the before and the early stages of removing the Bavlia when it was growing at the bottom. Now, I need to remind you about how difficult and how tough the actual terrain was. And one of the decisions we took very early on was that, look, in this highly stressed rocky environment with hardly any soil, let's presume that Bavlia had shown us where it was possible for a plant to grow. So the formula was, wherever we were taking Bavlia out from, wherever we were actually creating a pit, that was going to be a place for a new plant to go in, right? Got a lot of water bottles here, sorry. The first bit of planting we did was in the rainy season of 2006. We had started doing the excavation in April of 2006. So we only had a lead time of about 3 months before the rains came. And in that first year, because the plants that we'd raised from seed, from the desert, were still very small, you almost couldn't see what we'd planted. Most of what you're seeing here is Cleome, which is a seasonal plant that comes up on its own along with some grasses. So we were not responsible for any of the green that you're seeing here, although our plants are actually in there somewhere, but not visible. And we noticed that that first year there was practically nothing for us to feel good about. You know, we'd planted something like 1,400, 1,500 plants, all of them about 1.5 feet high, all swallowed up in that first flush of what you get naturally when there is a rainy season. And by the second year, we were still not sure that what we were doing was actually producing sizable results. We would go around looking at the plants, and what we found was that we were getting something like 65 to 70% survival rates, and we thought, how do we actually now try and understand this ecology, this soil, and what the plants need when you're trying to grow them here? I should tell you that the person we were using as a resource was a gentleman called Dr. M.M. Bhandari, who is regarded as the big dada of desert flora. He'd written a book, the definitive book on the flora of the desert. But one of the problems with floras, and this is not just true of Bhandari's book, but practically any flora that you pick up in India, is that basically, their aim is to arrange the plants phylogenetically by family. They're not really concerned with the ecology. So if you're looking for information and hints about what particular kind of site quality plants need when you're planting them, this information is not available in floras, right? So we began to feel that, look, unless we actually looked at every single pit and kept detailed pit reports and pit notes, we were not going to learn about why we were only getting 65% survival rates and not 100%. So in year 2, we started this business of pit reporting. And essentially, every single pit was measured for depth, We were working with 3 different kinds of soil mixes. So the kind of soil mix was recorded. We were beginning to use mycorrhiza in pellet form. That was recorded. The species was recorded, and the site quality was recorded. And we hoped that by keeping pit records for something like 2 years, some kind of pattern would emerge. And this is the kind of information that we got. So if you do your pit reports in an Excel sheet, for example, what you can organize your species, your columns, so that all the same species comes up together. And we began to see, not in every case, but in, let's say, about 60% of the cases, you started seeing patterns. So if you realize that, for example, the bordi, the bear, what's called the bear here, will not grow in a pit that is less than X number of feet, then you can make that correction. And we started making those corrections, and over the next few years, actually started getting pretty much 100% results, with the exceptions of physical damage by wild boars or by hares or dogs in the park. So this is just a few pictures to show you how this one particular part of the park actually progressed in the space of the first 6 or 7 years. This is a relatively recent picture to show you basically how. So the first place we would have planted in would have been the lower bit, because this was cleared first. And then how the bit that is much more rocky with much less soil and much further away from water, actually progressing much slower. Now, I want to also show you a little bit about experiments that we were making to try and see whether the purely rocky tekras, they call them tekras in Marwar, tekras also a Hindi word, but there were some of these rhyolite tekras that looked formidable because there was absolutely nothing growing on them, not even a blade of grass. And we began to realize fairly early on that there are actually little cracks in the rock that offer opportunities for small plants to grow in, and sometimes even big plants to grow in. And we started reading about what are called chasmophytes, which essentially are plants that will actually grow in a chasm, which is a bigger word for a crack. And we started doing something that we call vibhuti karan, which sounds terribly like a BJP kind of activity, but it's not. All we meant was that we started basically using slightly clay-rich mud and letting it, sprinkling it on the tops of these tekras. And with the help of our khandwalias, in the space of 3 or 4 years, we started getting results, even in terms of these purely rocky areas. And I'm just going to lead you through a few pictures to give you a sense of how this was very, very slow, mind you. So this is something that actually happened over the space of about 4 years, right? Now, all this time, all this while, we are beginning to discover some of the secrets of what is helping plants to grow in extremely difficult areas in the desert. And one of the discoveries was this particular grass called Oropitium, which has an extremely important role in dry, rocky ecologies, including the ridge in Delhi and other parts of Delhi, not even necessarily the ridge. And what we began to see was that Oropitium actually forms, any little place like this depression in rock here, wherever you had the ability of soil to collect, you would have airborne seed from Oropitium. This is Oropitium actually in flower here. But Oropitium had a symbiotic relationship with liverworts. And the liverworts and the Oropitium would actually create a stratum on top of the soil and bind the soil, which was extremely important, especially in sandy areas, because otherwise the soil would just blow away. And wherever we looked, wherever there was soil actually on top of rock, it was always held in place by the Oropitium. And Oropitium became an extremely important ally for us in planting up. This is an example of a place that is actually not in Jodhpur, but the entire rock, all the crust of soil that you're seeing, about 3 or 4 inches of soil there, entirely held in place by Oropitium. Here again, we're talking probably of about 10 inches of soil there. The grasses you're seeing on top is all something else. It's all Aristida. It's not Oropitium. But the Aristida could not have actually colonized this rock unless the Oropitium had done that work earlier. So we started using Oropitium initially when we tried to, there was a gully called Hati Neher, which was actually 500 years old and constructed through a hill to bring water by gravity from a high point down to a lake in the Rajodha Desert Rock Park. And we decided to try and create our first walking trail in the gully, but to plant it up specially and not, to do it in a much more intensive way than we'd done the rest of the park. So I just want to lead you through a few pictures that show you how this work happened, essentially by using Oropitium as our main ally. Here you can actually see people using, basically taking a khurpa and being able to take small slices of it to actually create these little opportunities in the rocks. All of this is done with the help of Oropitium. And 2013, and then more recently, the transformation of this space was absolutely unbelievable. This is now what Rajodha Park looks like. And before I go, I just wanted to show you these 2 pictures. This is the result of 12 years of having removed all the Bavlia and grown new plants. And for me and for colleagues who work with me in other rocky parts of India, it's been really gratifying to know that, even though the desert is slow, we have a very small growing period, you can actually get fantastic results if you plant the right things in the right ways. The next picture just shows you a small garden in our visitor center in Jodhpur, where we don't have more than 1.5 feet of soil in most parts of this garden. But other than the neem tree that is hanging over us, every single plant here is native to some part of the desert. Now I'm going to move away from Jodhpur to try and tell you that, in the course of looking for plants in the desert, we would travel every year 4 or 5 times at least and look at other places in the desert, some of which had plants that we liked, we wanted to bring back to Rajodha Park, and we kept failing. We found that the plants would not take in the kind of soil and the kind of minerals that we had in Rajodha Park. And we began to realize that we're looking at places in the desert that have different minerals, different kinds of rocks, different kinds of soils, and that unless we were able to actually create raised beds for these soils, we were not going to be able to use these plants. So these are all examples of different kinds of rocky habitats within the Thar Desert. This is one plant, for example, called Blepharis syndica, which I think we must have tried for 3 years to bring back seeds and to grow them in Rajodha Park, and it just refused to grow in the particular minerals that we had in Rajodha Park, until we decided that we would actually bring its soil in. One of my favorite plants in the desert is a plant called Phog Caligonum, which grows in slightly salty sand, so it doesn't even grow in rocky places. And we longed for an opportunity to actually be able to grow Phog in our park, but we didn't have sand, right? So this is what the entire, when you go to the Phog areas in the desert, this is what it looks like. And even from the air, you get these amazing views of what Caligonum looks like in the desert. So what we decided to do, I think in 2011, was a plant like this one. The first time we found this plant, it's called Salsola. The first time we found Salsola, we tried to dig it up and take it back. And we said we will provide Salsola with its own soil. And usually the tactic was that we would want to sweep the topsoil on the assumption that the topsoil had seed of this plant. And we would bag that soil with the seed-bearing soil, in cement kattas, and then we'd bring more of the soil back. In this case, we actually had to dig up this, because we didn't find seed of Salsola. We dug up this particular plant, and we brought it back, and we started to create little raised beds as almost like exhibitions in part of the Rajoda Park. So this particular bed that you see here we're still starting the beds. This was the first bed where we planted it. And then over the next few months, that's Salsola planted in one little corner with its own soil. This is Salsola beginning to really come alive just as the rains are starting. And then this is Salsola now beginning to flourish. This is probably taken sometime in September, just as the rains are finished. And then we realized that Dr. Bhandari had not described the flowers of Salsola stocksii, because he says in his book, I have not seen the flowers of Salsola. It is a rare plant, and therefore I will not describe the flowers. But it is reported that the flowers are like this. But we had Salsola flowering like it was going out of style. And we had tiny little bees coming to this Salsola and just doing an amazing job. So we were extremely encouraged by the fact that we had found a way of actually cultivating pretty much anything we saw. But what was absolutely essential to the enterprise was bringing in the right soil and bringing in the seeds and putting those seeds in the soil. All of these, all we did was bagging the seed-bearing soil, bringing the soil back, putting it into these pits. Sometimes the pit go underground if you need more soil, because especially with sandy plants, unlike rocky plants, tend to put all their energy into developing their roots. So you can get, there's a plant called buoy, for example, which if it's 1 foot above the ground, will tend to have a root that is about 6 feet long, because sand will yield, sand does not offer resistance, and plants can actually reach moisture if they're growing in sandy places by putting all that energy into their root system. So this was a great lesson for us. We then started, I was offered an opportunity in 2015 to plant up a formal garden in Nagaur Fort called Abha Mahal. And I was reluctant to do this because I don't really have a great affinity for formal gardens. But Lady Helen Hamlin, who was supporting the project, said, "Pradip, I won't take no for an answer. You've got to do this." And I said, "Look, Helen Hamlin, I don't do this. I don't do these kinds of things." She said, "I'm not going to take no." So I said, "Okay, I'll do it on condition you allow me to use native plants from the desert." And she said, "I'll allow you to use native plants from the desert if you promise me that your native plants will flower in February when the Sufi festival takes place." And I said, "I can't do that. I can't promise any plants will flower in February for you unless they're exotic English flowers." But she finally agreed that I could plant native flowers. And what we did here essentially was the same thing. We used every single plot to use soils that we thought were apt for the particular plants we wanted to plant here. And there were essentially some large plots where we had only a single kind of plant. But we also were using the idea of parterres, as in a Mughal garden, and dividing up some of these larger plots into little plots to see whether we could do formal arrangements with what were untried wild plants. And this is a picture of my beloved pogue, the Caligonum. So we dug down 6 feet into this kyari, 6 feet digging down, several trucks of soil being brought from something like 400 kilometers away, but only a few bags of seed-bearing soil sprinkled on the top. And we just had this magnificent, this is only 2.5 years, 3 years maybe from the time that we actually planted this. So other than the pogue, we then had this kind of stuff happening with our other native plants. And some of them didn't work. We've had to change them. Some of them obviously will not breed in captivity or will not flourish in captivity, but others did. And it was very, very interesting to see how just by manipulating the soil, getting the right soils, and and then getting the seeds, you could actually get wonderful effects. See, my feeling is that when you plant plants that are, cliches, nobody looks at them twice. I've seen this again and again in places that I've had work to do in. So unless you can actually, people get inured to seeing the same. If we planted Hamelia patens here, or I don't know, something very common, I don't think anybody would have looked at these twice. But suddenly you had textures and colors and and shapes that were completely different. Okay. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about Kishanbagh, because in 2016, me and a group of colleagues were offered a place in Jaipur, which is a strange kind of derelict space where essentially sand dunes had blown into the foot of the Nahargarh hills and been trapped. Obviously, the sand dunes couldn't proceed any further once they'd met the impediment of the hills, right? And I had been asked to come to Jaipur, and I was shown all these municipal gardens by the Horticulture Department of the JDA, and I said, look, I'm not interested in doing one of your municipal gardens. And that's when they brought me here, and they said, would you be at all interested in restoring this kind of habitat? And I said, yes. I said, this is just the ideal kind of situation that I would like to actually work on. Now, this is roughly what it looked like when we went there in 2016. And the opportunity that I saw when I first went there was to actually see whether we could bring in aspects of the sandy desert that had excited us when we'd been exploring the especially Jaisalmer district. Now, this is a photograph of a particular kind of ecology and a particular kind of habitat that we would see in small patches in southern Jaisalmer, and we'd started seeing them roughly 4 years before 2016. And we would ask people, local people, and we would say, what do you call this kind of habitat? If your camel goes into this kind of area, because it was a shrubland. Very few things other than the kind of keep that you see on the left have any height. It's mostly kind of waist high, but extremely rich and extremely highly populated with little things like reptiles, for example. But also very fragmented and fractured, tiny little, areas left. And we started calling it, after 3 plants that we could see very clearly, the senio, the buoy, and the keep, we would call it the SBK habitat. And we'd always say, there's a bit of SBK, and we'd want to photograph it and love it and see it. But nobody could tell us what it was called because they just regarded it as kuch nahi tha. And finally, we met a guy, and he said, हाँ साहब, इसको हम रोई बोलते हैं, रोई. And we said, tell us again, repeat the word roi for us. And he said, roi. So we asked a friend of ours in Bangalore who wasn't with us, and we said, look, can you please look up the word roi on Google Auntie and tell us what roi, whether roi means anything. And she called back and she said, there's only one reference to roi on Google, and that reference is Colonel James Todd coming on camelback from Sindh to Jaisalmer in 1829, and he says the jungle of the desert is called the roi. And we realized that we'd stumbled on what is actually a very, a vanishing part of the desert. These are now, when the forest department, for example, tries to create habitat for the Great Indian bustard, they tend to plow up these areas and only plant savan grass in it. But actually, the richness and the diversity that you get in these areas is very, very special. But nobody knows it. The forest department doesn't conserve it, and they don't have a name for it. And we thought that it was an opportunity for us in Kishanbagh in Jaipur to actually see whether we could recreate parts of it, even if the minerals weren't exactly right, but even if not, to celebrate it and to inject the word Roi into the vocabulary that Indian ecologists and wildlife people and birders use to describe certain parts of the desert, on the grounds that if you don't have a name for it, you're not likely to celebrate it, you're not likely to conserve it. But if you have a name, see, there are other shrublands, waist-high shrublands in the world, such as the chaparral in California, or the garrigue in the south of Spain and south of France, or the feinbosch in South Africa, or the mulga region in Australia. These are all shrublands in very dry, arid lands. And they're all some of the most visited and the most photographed and the most celebrated ecologies of their countries. And I thought, Roi is waiting for that. So this is what we tried to do here. We decided that these hills erode, they were really in bad shape. You can see all the little pathways being made by goats and cows and camels. We decided that we would collect, we would identify 5 different types of Roi. I should add one thing. We also discovered that Roi does not describe one particular assemblage of plants, but that in the desert, as you move from one area to another, for example, if you moved into a Jurassic landscape, where you had a lot of iron-rich sandstone, the plants would change, the grasses would change, right? But it was still called a Roi. So the Roi was like a generic term that described not one assemblage of plants, but changing assemblages of plants in the desert. So we identified these 5 different kinds, and we said, let's just bring them here. We basically put them into cement bags. We had little markings for different kinds of soils, and then we would spread the soils, as you're seeing with those pictures on the left, to see whether these would take. And in some cases, they didn't take at all. There's a plant called Lana, for example, one of the haloxylons, which just did not take. There was not a single seed that germinated in this area because there would have been a mismatch. But something like Tephrosia falciformis, which grows only in one particular dune system about 60 kilometers south of Jaisalmer, we had these wonderful results almost immediately. And in fact, a slightly comic event, because my friend Vijay, who's sitting in the audience, rang me up and he said, Pradip, it's germinating, and the seeds are germinating and they're still above the ground, but the bloody ants are taking the germinated seeds away. And I said, Vijay, you need to try and distract the ants somehow. Can you find, something that that the ants might like more than the seeds? So Vijay went and bought some broken rice, and he scattered the rice there. And then he sent us a video, and the video has his excited voice in the background. And he's saying, "Dekho, chhod diya usne. Ab बढ़ गया उसके बाद, अरे फिर से छोड़ दिया." But finally, the ant actually left the seeds behind, took the broken rice, and walked away with it. So the Tephrosia was amazingly quick results. This is what happened in the space of the first year with the Tephrosia falciformis. There's actually a sad end to this, because the Tephrosia now, because so many other things have grown up around it, we realized later Tephrosia does not like competition. So it will do brilliantly if it's on a bare dune, but the minute it faces competition, Tephrosia says, I'm out of here. Anyway, just another example of, this was Bui looking quite sad after the rains had started, but Bui did really, really well. This is a kind of Eirva from the Amaranthus family that has just completely covered the Medan, which we just heard today has been burnt, but anyway. These are the way the grasses sprang up. These are Aristidas. Some of the Aristida was there anyway, but we just had a beautiful flush of grasses. This was actually taken after the first rainy season. And this is what the area looks like now, having built, we call this the Longhouse, which is an area from which visitors will actually come and then start walking within this area. But then here too we said, let's use this idea of being able to create microhabitats and show visitors some of the plants that they won't be able to see because they need special soils. So we started creating these microhabitats here, bringing the soil in collecting the soil from these areas, and then doing what we had done in Jodhpur with the smaller microhabitats, and then getting these kinds of results. Zygophyllum, for example, here at the bottom, is only found in Jaisalmer district and only grows in iron-rich gravel. So you give it its soil and it will do really well. Try and grow it anywhere else, it's not going to grow. So these were just wonderful lessons to learn and to watch it all happening. Pogue also done really, really well in this area. And I'm going to stop very close to this. This is what the microhabitats look like now. This picture was probably taken 2 or 3 months ago. And this is what the back end of the park looks like in relation to the city of Jaipur. So we're actually very much part of the city, but the path you're seeing here actually leads to the dunes that you see on this side of the park. I'm going to end there, and I'm going to invite you all to ask questions if you so choose. Are we going to sit? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So you want the mics given to people in the audience? Do you have another mic? All right. Any questions? No, we
So that was wonderful. My name is Jyotsna Dayal. I do landscaping, but I wish I was so good. Sir, for example, Abha Mahal. Here is a property which has to be launched. How do you handle impatient clients who will not wait from 211 to 218? Usko kal apna hotel kholna hai. How do you do that?
No, Abha Mahal was not 11 to 18. It was. Is this okay? Is this working? That was just 3 years. But
Okay.
no, it's true. If people are in a hurry, then we just say, look, can't be done. That's as simple as that,
Because your plants are not available in the market, sir.
So wherever we have planted, the first thing we do is to start a nursery. So that's the only way to. I mean, now that we have Rao Jodhar Desert Rock Park Nursery going, we have a stock of plants if they're relevant. But if somebody asked me to plant in, say, Uttarakhand or in Madhya Pradesh, then very few of those plants would actually be germane to those areas. So the first thing we do is we start a nursery and collect seeds.
Thank you, sir.
I've been hoping for a long time to try and encourage or help a huge nursery of native plants in Delhi, but it's just not happened so far. But that's not for the public. It's not a commercial nursery. It's a fantastic nursery, but it's for themselves.
My name is Madhu Bhalla. I'm not an architect, but I've been mulling over an idea of, getting into organic farming in the Shikhavati belt. Do you think that could be a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, why would you have any doubts?
Well, the soil structure, and would it be all organic or would we need chemicals there?
See, one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize in this particular presentation is that the soil is everything. People tend to say, हम अपने बगीचे में ये पेड़ लगाएंगे और ये लगाएंगे. They think of plants first, but you really need to think of soils first. The relationship of soil to the plant is so elemental and so important. But rather than try and change your soil in any major way, you need to adapt your plants to the soil that exists there. So you need to understand your soil and grow things that will be happy in that particular soil. I'm very happy to do so. planting plan? No. So Kishan Bagh is going to end in the next 6 or 7 months, the planting work. We're very concerned about how it's going to be managed because it's a government-owned property, and if it goes the way in which most government parks go, it'll be disastrous. So we're trying to see whether there is a way of managing it, not ourselves perhaps, but just by thinking of a good system. But I, quite frankly, I plan to give up all forms of planting by the end of next year. And I want to write instead. I can't write and plant at the same time.
My name is Vandini. I'm interested in understanding when soils, as you've said, is such an important part. So when you're bringing in soils from really far away areas and putting it in, even from Jaisalmer to Jodhpur, how does that sort of change the ecology of, from sandy to rocky sandy? Or I'm sure they're sort of, I'm not an expert at this at all, but I'm just curious that, there is distance traveled and there's different ecosystems, etc.
Yeah. So, in an ideal world, we should have been able to test every part of Kishan Bagh for the minerals available there, and then tested all the places where we wanted to bring soil from. That didn't prove to be very practical. So what we were doing instead was we were only targeting other places that had sand dunes, that had shifting sand, right? Because this was shifting sand. This sand had probably blown in from Jaisalmer anyway. The origins of this sand, we had established that this sand was what's called aeolian, which is wind blown rather than brought by water, right? So the question was looking for a mineralogical match. And that's why one of the plants we tried there just didn't take at all. Wasn't salty enough. But the others have, they've all taken. So it's a question of trial and error, right? And then once you know that something is working, you can build on that the next year and the next. But the sand, the sand offered a good match, basically.
Hi, my name is Priyank. I want to know, why is it important to plant in the areas if there are no plants there? Like if it's a rocky, why is it important to put plants there?
Well,
to green the space.
There are, for example, this particular habitat in Jodhpur, it had very distinct knolls, tekras, where there were no plants, right? And all these tekras have been left alone, except for the one where we actually experimented with that, But all the valley, they call them gals in Marwadi. All the gals fill up with plants in the rainy season, right? These are ephemerals, they're seasonals, and then they disappear. So the idea was to try and find perennial plants that would actually grow in these gals, because they become quite unsightly. This is a value judgment, but they become unsightly when they, when they dry up. So we're not actually trying to plant the tekras, we're planting the gals. But I agree with you, I can imagine, there are, for example, granitic habitats that I've seen in Rajasthan, which are gorgeous without being, totally greened. Nevertheless, even in a granitic habitat, you will get cracks in the rock that are actually, thickly vegetated with interesting things such as dhok, such as Anogeistis pendula, which is one of my favorite trees in the desert.
Hi, after you've finished planting a landscape like the Rao Jodha, for example, it's established, then is there what kind of ongoing sort of maintenance, and if any ongoing maintenance, or still kind of creating a certain view for people on the walking paths of a park like that? Is there anything that goes into it, or your initial planting is what you do and then after a certain establishment period you let it go?
So it varies. In a place like Rao Jodha Park, one of the things we've tried to do very carefully is to make sure that we're not having to water anything or to give any kind of khad or nutrients or fertilizer to anything once it's established. So after the first 3 months of establishing a plant, water is withdrawn. If we see a plant dying for lack of water, the formula is let it die, replace it with a plant that will survive better than this plant. It's the wrong plant in the wrong place. However, we actually keep our team of Malis very busy because there is a heck of a lot of maintenance of pathways. For example, we have 4 major trails for visitors inside Rao Jodha Park. Those trails have to be maintained, which means that everything that's coming in the way of people's faces, especially if they're thorny, they need to be trimmed. We identify certain plants that we don't really want because they're aggressive and invasive. Sometimes they're exotic as well. They need to be actually removed. And there's a fair amount of work of that kind, but it's not watering. We're not watering anything, right? We've also been fairly fecund in thinking of new ideas. So for example, in Rao Jodha Park, just thinking of those raised beds, for example, was one of the ideas. We now have a new geological idea, which is to actually display rocks from the desert and interpret them for visitors so that they can understand the rocks that you tend to see when you drive around in the desert. That's a new idea. My new idea now is we tend to have a lot of feral dogs in the park. And the park actually has 3, even though they're kind of connected, they're 3 discrete portions of the park. But we want to try and introduce foxes into one of the sections. So to find a way of actually removing the feral dogs, prevent people from feeding them, and somehow find a way of getting a pair of foxes to come in there, perhaps some hares as well. So there are always ideas you can think of to make a park look more interesting. One of the failures, of Rao Jodha Park as a place is that it doesn't really have grazing animals in it. And for the park to be really successful, you would need to actually have grazers there in numbers that were sustainable. But we don't have grazing animals in there.
I'll pass it on to you. First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful
Where is this coming
talk.
from?
That's from here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you think your role in repairing certain landscapes that have been damaged and maybe historically being revitalized is more the direction of expediting a phenomenon that the nature would over a longer period establish, and subsequently, like you were telling about this other park, subsequently the entire ecosystem of that place is going to further evolve because you are putting a seed in a certain direction which certainly has most probably unforeseen dynamics as against what we normally see right now. I mean, there are certainly negative aspects to that as well. Like in Ladakh, I've heard many years back, people started using plant material that came from Srinagar and trying to grow plants that may be very, very unlike what you have attempted, of course. Plant material that was alien to the place and created a new dynamics to the place. The entire ecosystem changed, the weather changed, and wind direction, wind patterns changed. Do you foresee in your very sensitive approach any of this kind of new development and a evolution that would be then placed in future? Thank you.
So to answer the first part of your question first, which was you were saying, would nature achieve the same thing on its own, right? Well, certainly not in Rao Jodha Park. Rao Jodha Park was a complete wasteland that had been taken over by Bavlia, by Prosopis juliflora, which very effectively keeps out any kind of competition by secreting the alkaloid in its root zone. So it was a ruined landscape invaded by a very, very aggressive alien plant, right? So if we had left that alone, there's no way that you would have actually had a native or a natural scape coming out. It was very unsightly as well. It was very, very unsightly. No bird nests in it. You know, the bird count, one of my big regrets was we never did a bird count in the very beginning. But the bird count would probably have been in the region of 40, 45 birds when we began. It's now crossed 200. And the reason is simply because there are now so many different kinds of, you know, bushes and food for birds, you know, which would not have been the case had you only had Prosopis juliflora dominating this place to the extent that it did. The second question about, you know, are you in danger of compromising the species that grow there? We were, well, first let me just say that, for example, with Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park, one of the things that excited me roughly 2 years into the project was beginning to understand what an important role grasses tend to play in these dry, rocky places. We now have something like 70 species of grasses in Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park. If Dr. M.M. Bhandari is right, we have another 4 species to go to actually have the complete assemblage of grasses that will grow in rocky substrates, right? Now, having got these grasses, we didn't quite know how these grasses would actually work with each other. You don't normally get 70 species of grasses in one area, you know. You will tend to have 5 or 10 or 12 or 15, but you won't get all 70. So we were actually, in a way, we were pitching them all into one area and saying, well, now, you know, let the dynamics take its own course. If one grass is more aggressive and dominates the other ones, well, so be it. That's the way it's going to be. But they were all basically desert rock grasses from other rhyolite spaces in the desert. You know, I'm not aware that there's any danger at all of, you know, anything going wrong there. In Kishenbagh, it was a different situation because here we were doing this not just with grasses but with actual plant ecologies. We were saying, look, 5 different ecologies. We don't know how the dynamics are going to work out, whether Pogue will actually dominate something else, you know, and edge it out. But that too is fair game, you know. But given the fact that Jaipur has more rainfall than the places from which we were actually sourcing these plants, yes, there was possibility of things happening that we had not considered, we didn't know about. But I'm not aware that there's any other danger. Much too early to say, but, you know, just theoretically, I don't know the danger.
Yeah.
There's a...
Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah. You've talked a bit about the interpretation that you've developed in Rao Jodha. So if you could talk a little more about what the learnings were and what drove it, or how people are reacting to it, and how this outreach part of your work is playing a role in maybe even furthering this approach.
All right, so I have a slightly dismal view of the extent to which the interpretation is working, because we actually have, you know, last year for the first time, Rao Jodha Park actually earned back the money it's spending, which was amazing. We had never expected that to happen. But the sad fact is that if I was to be honest about the kind of people who come to the park, I would say that 40% of the people who come come to take selfies. And I've had very sad encounters with people who, you know, people coming out of the park, for example, and I say, look, would you like me to ask one of my naturalists to explain the raised beds to you and what they're... They said, selfie le liya. So there is a, you know, we don't have an audience, I don't think, that is curious enough or interested enough. At the same time, there's been a huge change from the early days where the local people came and said, Sahab, yahan kya hai, kuch nahi, jungle hai, you know, there's nothing to interest us at all. Then they started seeing foreigners coming, and then they started coming, but the numbers are huge now. They're not massive, but, you know, we're getting something in the region of 100 people a day in this kind of weather, for example, which for me is huge, from a trickle of 2 and 3, you know. I don't know what is going to change this. I don't know how you can actually have a lollipop that is so delicious that more people will want to, to see these things. We've tried to, I mean, Kishenbagh is much more interpretive in the sense that the entire walkway is raised above the ground because we don't want people walking directly on the sand. And therefore they're confined to a particular walkway. And that walkway leads through 5 interpretive spaces. One about rocks and fossils, one about the roi, where we introduce the roi, one that leads to 2 other kinds of rocky habitats, one on granite, one on quartzite, and then finally one about the microhabitats of the desert. And then people finally come to a space that we call the longhouse, from where they look out on the whole area. And the idea there is to give them interpretive ideas that are just fun, such as pictures that show them what, the marks that different animals make when they walk on the sand. Just the kind of, what are they called? They're called, No, pug marks tends to be deeper, but on sand they're just very, very. But anyway, just to try and engage somebody's interest, But there is a very, very strong sense at the moment that people, even in Kishenbagh, we've had some people coming in, and very soon you see them going. It's worldwide. It's not just Indians. Somebody over there.
Hi, I'm Vishal Bhatia. I have 3 questions actually. The first question is, what's your opinion about vertical wall gardens, especially in an urban concrete jungle like Delhi? Shouldn't there be a law that every alternate house should at least have some basics about a vertical wall garden? The second question is, I stay very close to Sanjay One in Vasant Kunj. Towards the Lado Sarai exit, there is a big board which says that this is a medicinal garden, but actually there's nothing, just weeds. And the only medicinal plant which I saw over there was white dhatura. And my final question is, the question number 3, Kew Gardens received 1 million visitors last year over 12 months. Keukenhof is only open for 2 months in Holland, and they received something like 1.5 million visitors. So if you extrapolate it over 12 months, that's like 9 million. So 9 million plus 1 million adds up to 10 million. That's the number of tourists India gets with monuments like, the Qutub Minar or the Taj Mahal. So are we doing enough to attract, horticulture tourism or plant tourism? Especially given the fact that, we have a huge variety of plants. And I've also observed that Ayurveda originated in India, and there's a huge ignorance about certain plants which are growing in your backyard. And there's one such Ayurvedic herb called Shatavari, which is a panacea for all gynecological ailments. And forget about women, even men are not aware that Shatavari is actually growing in the backyard. It's a very common garden plant. So first question was on concrete walls, vertical wall garden, sorry.
Well, I must say I don't like vertical wall gardens myself. I'm not a big fan of. At least what I see, I've seen pictures from other places in the world where they seem to look quite attractive, but I don't think that we've found. I haven't seen anything that I've come across in India that looks even halfway nice. The ones that I've seen are pretty awful. They're very plasticky, and they're very. They need a lot of care and a lot of, and I think that partly because I'm into trying to do things that are sustainable, that don't require a lot of attention, a lot of care. So I'm not a big fan of vertical gardens, although I think in principle I'd love to see a vertical garden actually happening in, there's a place called Kilbari above Nainital that has natural vertical gardens. They're some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. They're just literally hillsides that have been cut because there's a road going there, and you just have the most amazing plants and mosses growing in these vertical. Those are gorgeous, But the ones I see, the ones that there's one near the Prime Minister's house. I don't like them at all, quite frankly. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that, I'm afraid. But you know. The second question was about horticultural tourism. Yeah. Medicinal plants, yeah. So, you know, this medicinal plant thing actually is, it became very big about 10 years ago because some UN department suddenly started offering some money to raise medicinal plant gardens, and the forest department and some horticultural departments suddenly started, you know, creating these gardens, which, quite frankly, I haven't seen a single one, at least in this country, that is even halfway interesting. You tend to have carries with a name there, and then you just a few plants which might look nice for the first few months, and they start degrading. But, you know, when I've been working in Rajasthan, for example, in the desert, quite frankly, I don't know that there is a single plant that is not medicinal. You ask local people, and whether they are actually medicinal, whether this is myth, whether it is actual, whether it is, you know, superstition, I don't know. But everything is regarded as being medicinal. And if everything is medicinal, then just, you know, you're free to grow your own garden. Shatavari is actually very well known. One of the plants I've used in the Abha Mahal, you know, the on those little raised things was asparagus, actually, racemosus. Sorry, I'm losing track of what was the last question you asked? Yeah. Yeah. So horticultural tourism in India. Now, you see, I'm aware that there is some, not a lot. There's some specialist stuff. I know that people come here for Mughal gardens, for paradise gardens, because they find that that is unique, not necessarily just to India, but Afghanistan has some, perhaps Iran has some as well. But, you know, quite frankly, I'm not surprised that other gardens that we have in this country are not celebrated or visited. I mean, we have horrible gardens. We probably have the worst gardens in the world. I promise you. I mean, I travel a lot, and I'm very ashamed of our municipal gardens. I think they're really, really terrible. Yeah, no, but that's perhaps not a fair comparison for various reasons. But, you know, the level of our horticulture, especially at the civic level, is abysmal. And why would anybody want to come here and look at a park, you know? It's as simple as that. But I've often wondered whether we could try and get more footfalls of foreign tourists who come to visit the Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur. And we found that we can't really, the kind of people we get tend to be backpackers. And the reason there is that basically most people come there as tour packages, where the guys who are doing the tour packages saying कि साहब हमको यहाँ से क्या मिलना है यार, 100 रुपए का टिकट है, 100 रुपए का अगर 10% भी हमको मिलेगा तो 10 रुपए लेके क्या करेंगे? So they don't come. But they're basically they're not shepherded there by the people who do the tours, for the reason that there's no money to be made.
Hi, sir. I have two questions again. One is, after rewilding project is complete, what systems need to be put in place to ensure that it actually stays for a long time? Because what we are seeing with the Aravali Park, or anything that could happen that's not in our hands to the project. And secondly is a kind of a clarification from your presentation about the table you shared. So the pit depth is how deep the site was dug to plant the seed, or what was it exactly?
Yeah, so to answer your second question first, when the Bavlia was removed, a pit was dug, right? We insisted that the pit had to be dug to a depth of 2.5 feet at the minimum, but they were also told that if they found a particular bar, what they called a bar in Marwadi, they could continue and make a deeper pit for us, right? So you actually ended up with pits of different depths. So the pit depth mattered, right? But what needs to be done to perpetuate a park depends on the what's happening in the park. But in an ideal world, you basically need to write a manual. So I would say that next year when I stop working on Rajodha Park, I will try and leave behind a manual that actually describes all the things that I regard as being important to be continued. So even though there are people who've worked with me all these years, all these 12, 13 years that I've been there, they will also eventually, retire, drift off. So it's very important to enshrine the basic principles of what you've done and how you've done. For example, I saw on Facebook yesterday, one of my guys had posted a picture of azolla, which is a kind of water fern which grows naturally there, and he'd put in some pistia, the water cabbage. And he said that, people who are coming to the visitor center now are enjoying the pistia. And I said, Vinod, please get rid of pistia. It is not native. It's not something we want. It's invasive. It's alien. So you got rid of it quickly, But so you have to be careful of these things, And people will, with the best of intentions, do things that are not necessarily in the right thing to do.
Hello, thank you. I just wanted to ask you that have you thought of inviting local students, young students, children there, so that they grow a sense of belonging there and they see the new birds and tree plants and the animals, you said reptiles, so maybe that will be, they feel proud about it, and maybe that's the way to keep it going.
Yeah, so we haven't had a lot of success with schools. We, initially in the first 2 or 3 years, we would actually go and do presentations to schools, and there would be one token visit with often too many kids at one time. We often find that if you have 50 or 60 or 70 kids at one time, it actually becomes so unruly, and you don't really communicate to more than about 5 of them or 10 of them, So what we tried to do at one stage was we tried to tell one particular school that, look, we would train 2 of their teachers, and then their teachers could bring small batches of people whenever they did. It's worked very well with one school. It hasn't worked with other schools who initially came, but for them it's just a picnic, it's an outing. They're not really grabbed by it. I'll tell you who comes now more and more are people who come for pre-marriage shoots. They come with 6 changes of clothes. We have really nice loos in Rajodha Park, so they also enjoy the fact that they've got these lovely loos in which they can change their clothes. And they come with 3 sets of photographers, and they do all their pre-marriage photography there.
I would like to ask him. Of course, your work has a lot of parallels in the human society, where you have nomads moving, settling here. You have diversity happening in other parks. Do you discover, and that's out of curiosity, I would like to know, do you discover there are suddenly new species that emerge in this diversity, or by this shifting of species from one place to the other and creating a certain sustainability?
No, I haven't discovered new species, but one of the effects of collecting soil. See, we collect soil for 3 main reasons. One is that you're getting the minerals that you need as a starter for the plants that are used to that are growing in that medium. Second, you're getting mycorrhiza. Are you all familiar with mycorrhiza? Mycorrhiza basically it's a kind of fungus that has a relationship with rootlets. And if you get the right kind of fungus, the fungus actually is capable of making minerals available to the plants that are not otherwise available to the plants. So it's very important to try and get, even when you're getting grasses, you try and get the mycorrhiza that is available in the rhizome of the grass. But the other reason is that when you're collecting seed-bearing soil, you're also getting seeds not just of your target plant, not just of, let's say, Tephrosia falciformis, you're getting the whole community of little herbaceous things that are growing in that place. So you're not getting just one seed, you're getting maybe 15 kinds of plants, and that's very interesting. So you're introducing a community of plants into a new area, and not just one particular plant. But they've never, so far I've not been surprised. Have we been surprised, Vijay, by anything? I don't think so.
with succession, maybe more species will come in and some will go out, like Tephrosia falciformis is going out.
With people trying to convince them about your ideas, and I mean that also must be a battle of its own.
Well,
but
you know, quite frankly,
hung in there.
working with the Mehrangarh Museum Trust has been just sheer joy. They've been absolutely ideal people to work with. They've been so supportive and so open to ideas, and just given me a completely free hand. You know, they've never said no to an idea I've come up with. So they've been wonderful. And then on the other hand, working with government in Kishenbagh has been, in a way, very, very different, because you've had to deal with a very hidebound system that has very, hidebound procedures laid down for everything. But even there, I must say that the difference between working with them at the beginning and working with them now, there's a wonderful element of trust where they say, like, we know you guys are not going to take shortcuts. We know you're not going to shortchange us. We know you're not going to just do something to make money. So it's worked really nicely, So it's been very, very interesting from that point of view. But for me, for something like Abha Mahal, which is very small compared to everything else, it's also been wonderful to see things working there, and also then to have the freedom to correct things that don't work, Is that it?
I'd just like to ask a question too.
Sure.
May I ask one question before we all disperse? I was just thinking while you were talking, it's a very nice talk, and really opening the mind. How have you grown as your plants have grown?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, the truth is, the truth is, when I first started working at Rajasthan Park in 2005 is when it was first proposed to me, I was aware that I didn't really know enough about the desert. And I remember very clearly, we started removing the Bavlia from one small plot of maybe 2 or 3 hectares. And we pulled out, with the help of all our Khandwalias, we pulled out maybe 200 or 300 plants. And it looked like a piece of cheese, just all these holes. And there were donkeys going back and forth with panniers of soil and soil mix and filling up these. And I said, am I being just incredibly arrogant to think that I know what's going to grow here, And what if I fail? What if everything I'm putting in is just going to fail? And then I took comfort in the thought that, well, if I fail, I'll just put back the bloody Bavlia and say, I'm sorry, I didn't manage to do it. But it worked. The point is, it worked, and it worked because one was able to ask questions, to constantly, experiment, and to be intensely observant about the whole process. Not just there, but in the desert, and to try and understand these things. And it worked, and it worked better and better every year because you were learning all the time. But I don't know how to answer how I grew. I mean, obviously I became an avid plantsman. I had, I'd started off by writing my book about trees and not actually doing any planting. The planting happened along the way. But it's been a fantastic journey. I mean, but you grew every year. You grew all the time.
I think that's a fair enough answer for this evening. And I'd just like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for a brilliant talk. And we have really, I think, enjoyed, and your passion, I think that's where the growth happens. So thank you, Pradip, for spending this time with us and keeping us. Now we